Apologies to everyone for the technical glitches and whatnot. Let me begin by saying I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak today, not least because while I confess to never having been able to master speaking French, and that's a whole different story, I am very proud of my French heritage. My mother, having been born and raised till the age of 14 in the small town of Cominac in the department of Ariège, and I've enjoyed my time spent there and with my French cousins. Well, I've been invited to discuss the 2006 Encyclopedia, Puritans and Puritanism in Europe and America, which I co-edited with Tom Webster of the University of Edinburgh. And my plan today is to explain how I became interested in Puritanism, briefly discuss the encyclopedia, and then explain how my understanding of Puritanism has evolved over the years. I can date my interest in Puritanism very specifically to a class in American intellectual history that I took at Fordham College in New York in 1966. My fellow undergraduates and I were assigned to read Perry Miller's important essay, Errand into the Wilderness. That essay argued that New England, and by implication America, was founded by English Puritans to transform England and the world by creating a society that would be as a city on a hill. There's a long history of how that image was understood, used, and misused in terms of American national character, and I've made some contributions to those debates. But at the time, in 1966, what struck me was Miller's contention that when English Puritans moved towards some levels of toleration in the 1640s, New England Puritans turned their back on England. My interest in learning more about the relationship between the colonists and their native land has continued since that time, starting with my Columbia University dissertation, continuing till today. I've always tried to place Puritanism in an Atlantic perspective, and that's another reason why I'm so pleased to be speaking to this audience. When invited to edit an encyclopedia on Puritanism, which was finally published in 2006, I insisted on including both England and America in the work, and I invited Tom Webster of the University of Edinburgh to be co-editor. I had met Tom when I was conducting research in England for a book tracing network connections between Anglo-American congregational clergy, and he was working on a dissertation at Cambridge, tracing connections among English clergy. Well, working for the encyclopedia, we assigned a variety of scholars' essays that included the biographical sketches of the key individuals in the movement and other essays on the major events and ideas associated with Puritanism. Attention was paid to both England and America. But in order to understand what we did, let me take a few minutes to talk about how we conceived of the topic. And for those of you who are not that familiar with Puritanism, this might be a little sort of brief mini session on the movement. We saw Puritanism as the movement that emerged in English Protestantism in the 1530s, representing the efforts of Protestants who felt that the Reformation in their country was not progressing far enough or fast enough during the reigns of Henry VIII and then Edward VI. Then the real, if incremental, progress of reform came to an end with the accession of the Catholic Queen Mary Tudor to the throne in 1553. During her reign, hundreds of English Protestants, the Marian martyrs, were executed for holding to their faith. Many more fled to the continent, where they created exile churches, and yet others maintained their principles in underground churches, especially in London. Mary's death in 1558 led to the accession of her Protestant sister, Elizabeth. The new queen sought to structure the church in a way that wouldn't alienate anyone enough to push them into rebellion. This Elizabethan settlement was Protestant, but with some conservative changes to what was in place when Edward VI had died. Puritanism during Elizabeth's lengthy reign was an effort to push that reform further. The chief points on which most of those reformers agreed was Calvinist doctrine, removal of the remaining vestiges of Catholicism, such as clerical vestments, and the importance of a preaching ministry. Underlying these emphases was a belief in the inerrancy of the scriptures and a strong opposition to all things Roman Catholic. During Elizabeth's reign, Puritan efforts to shift the national church failed. But in regions where local leaders were sympathetic to the movement, university-trained preachers were installed in pulpits. Distasteful ceremonies were ignored, and conferences of lay believers sustained one another's faith. I've written how this developed in the Stour Valley borderland of the countries of Essex and Suffolk, where the future Massachusetts governor, John Winthrop, grew up in. In other regions, such initiatives failed, and Puritan clergy were cast out of their livings. Some of these ousted clergy joined with lay believers to set up their own congregations separate from local parishes. When the Scot, James I, followed Elizabeth to the throne in 1603, Puritans hoped that the new king might institute some of the practices of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, which most English reformers admired. But this was not the case, and under James, greater pressure was placed on Puritans to conform, leaving more to separate and some to emigrate to the Netherlands, where they established congregations in places such as Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Leiden. During the reign of James' son, Charles I, 1625 to 49, not only was pressure on Puritans increased, but it seemed to many that the English church was both diluting its Calvinist teachings and moving backwards towards reinstituting ceremonial Catholicism. Many more English Puritans began to emigrate, with many now going to America. There they established the colonies of Massachusetts, Plymouth, New Haven, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The tensions in England that prompted the Puritan migration continued to build until they contributed to the outbreak of the conflict variously known as the English Civil Wars or the Puritan Revolution of the 1640s. During that decade and the 1650s, ascendant English Puritans struggled to define a religious order they could all subscribe to. Their efforts came to an end in 1660 with the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in the person of Charles II. Puritans in England were for the most part forced from the national church and organized in separate denominations as Presbyterians, Congregationalists or Independents, and Baptists, all of which groups came to be lumped together as dissenters. When Charles II died in 1685, he was succeeded by his brother, James II, who was Catholic. The colonists in New England had supported the Puritan Revolution and offered advice on how the English church should be reformed. The fact that they had supported the revolution made them vulnerable after the Restoration. And after some incremental infringements on their liberties, their virtual independence came to an end when James II consolidated all of New England into a single super colony, the Dominion of New England, under a non-Puritan governor general. The policies of James II and the fears of an ongoing Catholic monarchy prompted the Glorious Revolution of 1688, with the stockholder of the Netherlands, William of Orange, and his wife, Mary Stuart, ousting James and being installed as monarchs. News of this prompted a similar uprising in New England, with the colonies regaining their separate identities. Puritans never recovered direct control of either England or New England, but the Puritan influence continued in both places into the 18th century. Okay, this was the story as Tom and I conceived it when we assigned articles for our Encyclopedia of Puritanism. Looking back, there are things which we missed. The focus really was on England and New England. Thus, we did not pay the attention we should have to other parts of the Americas, the Providence Island colony, Bermuda, Puritans in Virginia and Maryland, for example. Similarly, we could have devoted more space to Puritanism in Ireland and Scotland. As for topics, despite the suggestions of a great team of advisors, we missed some. Though there are biographical sketches of some women, the subject of women in the shaping of Puritanism should have received separate treatment, and it didn't. We had an entry on prophesying, but this only dealt with the clerical exercises that were promoted by Archbishop Grindal and halted by order of Queen Elizabeth. Prophesying as a way in which lay men and women could share their spiritual insights with fellow believers, sometimes during congregational services, was not covered. Now, some of this, of course, was due to the state of the field as it was in 2005, 2006. I'm currently working with two other scholars, Ann Hughes and Greg Salazar, editing a collection of essays, the Oxford Handbook of Puritanism. While not an encyclopedia, this collection will offer 31 essays on topics such as women in the shaping of Puritanism, Puritans and slavery, interactions with Native Americans, as well as studies of Puritan literature and how Puritanism has been understood over the centuries. Delayed by COVID-related interruptions in the work of some of our scholars, the book will probably not appear until 2024. It too, eventually, will need revision, which brings me to make some general reflections based on my own experience in the field. The past doesn't change. Our understanding of the past does change due to a variety of things, including the discovery of evidence previously neglected, the application of new methods to analyze artifacts of the past, asking new questions of familiar materials, and re-examining accepted truths. And I'll try to illustrate these points by sharing with you my understanding of how my understanding of Puritanism changed over the 50 plus years, good grief, I've been working in the field. In reflecting on my body of work, I realized that over the years, I've been implicitly following the advice of the Puritan pastor, John Robinson, who urged his followers always to be open to further light. He was speaking of the search for meaning in understanding the scriptures, but the same applies to historians who should be constantly re-examining the past and seeking to fill in the gaps of our understanding. He was directing his followers to question accepted beliefs and to find a better understanding of their faith. For me, the task has been a search for new insights into the beliefs and character of the men and women we call Puritans. You'll remember a few minutes ago, I stated that my interest in Puritanism began with a reading of Perry Miller's Errand into the Wilderness. And Miller's perspective was the Puritans came to America to provide a model for England, but as English Puritans veered towards toleration, New England turned its back on England. In researching that subject for my doctoral dissertation at Columbia and my first significant book, I revised some of Miller's conclusions, showing a continuing colonial support of the English Puritan cause. And in the process, I established a scholarly position as someone who saw early New England as part of a transatlantic Puritan movement. a perspective which is found in all of my work. Over time, I came to recognize that while there was significant unity in Puritanism, the suggestion of a uniform Puritanism was flawed. Most of the studies of Puritanism in New England had been based on what happened in Boston. I came to recognize that all New England was not Boston writ large, and I began to focus on variations of that theme, illustrating those differences in large-scale biographies of John Winthrop and John Davenport, and a book of short biographical essays on New Englanders who ended their lives in England, in Antigua, and elsewhere. All of the men and women I wrote about in these books were Puritans within any ordinary definition, but each had his or her own perspective. Regional variations also existed in New England and were significant. My research into some of those other people and regions also made me aware of the inaccuracy of the common view, first promoted by Edmund Morgan, that all who wished to join a New England Puritan congregation were required to give a so-called conversion narrative. For years, I had accepted that idea, and I incorporated it in some of my early writings, and there are still people who are arguing for it. But when I was studying the New Haven colony and the New Haven church established by John Davenport, I found no such recorded requirement for joining that church. And that prompted me to question how general the practice was. Was New Haven the exception to a general rule of conversion narratives? And in point of fact, there are very few examples of any such requirement, and those examples are questionable. Morgan's argument was based exclusively on the narratives that Thomas Shepard of the church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, recorded in a notebook. But it is not clear that these first-person accounts by believers had anything to do with admission. That was a logical assumption that Morgan made, but I think it was a flawed assumption. Indeed, the English Presbyterian William Rathband apparently alluded to these sessions when he wrote that he heard from a colonial correspondent that the people in Cambridge met together privately at certain times, weekly or fortnightly, each one to hold forth unto the rest the work of God upon his or her soul, from their first conversion unto that present day, so that their pastor might know how they grew in grace. And the former New Englander, Thomas Weld, who was in England and responded to Rathband, acknowledged that what Rathband described or had heard happen did occur. Weld described these as meetings of the saints for such a holy end. Now, considering evidence on both sides of the Atlantic, I came to believe that these statements and others such as them were not membership applications as such, but rather instances of lay believers sharing their religious experience for the benefit of others struggling to find grace or to persevere in grace. And this helps to explain why on the English side of the Atlantic, many such accounts were published. Obviously, that wasn't to get into a church. These were people who were already admitted. And there were accounts in John Rogers, Ohel, Beth Shemesh, Samuel Peddow's Roses from Sharon, and Vassava Powell's Spiritual Experiences of Sundry Believers. These were all published accounts of the narratives shared by people who had experienced grace. And they were intended to be, in a sense, evangelical, to help others reach the same grace. Now, as I did this, my new understanding of how the narratives may have functioned led me to turn away from the clergy, who had featured largely in my work and that of many scholars. Clergy, after all, leave us a lot of written evidence, but to look more seriously at the role that lay men and women had played in shaping Puritanism, whether through such narratives or elsewhere. I don't know if one can call it a paradigm shift or not, but what suddenly dawned on me was that virtually all of the contemporary histories of early Puritanism were written by clergy, not necessarily the studies of colonies like Bradford's journal or Winthrop's account, but the accounts of Puritanism itself were written by clergy. William Hubbard, Increase in Cotton Mather, Thomas Prince, Daniel Neal, etc. And that in a sense, these authors had a vested interest in emphasizing the importance of clerical authority. Whether they consciously told the story in a way that would credit the ministers or simply assumed the importance of the pastoral position, they downplayed or ignored the role of the lay congregation members. So I wrote Lay Empowerment and the Development of Puritanism. And in it, I trace the roots and development of the idea that lay men and women, with the inspiration of the Spirit, were as capable as the clergy of understanding the meaning of Scripture. I examined how this contributed to the rise of Puritanism and particularly Congregationalism. I found that one of the dynamics of 17th century Puritanism was the effort of clergy to extend an influence over the laity in their own congregations and to establish clerical bodies that would regulate regional groupings of the churches. And so authors such as Cotton Mather read the power balances they experienced into the first decades of colonial Puritanism, decades in which the laity played a much more significant role. That project led directly into a study of the particular congregation of believers that was formed in Scrooby, England, found a refuge for a decade in Leiden, the Netherlands, and then settled the Plymouth colony in 1620. One Small Candle, The Plymouth Puritans, The Beginnings of English New England, published in 2020, advances three revisionist positions. First, I eschew the word pilgrims in discussing the Plymouth settlers. They were, I argue, Puritans with some but not too many differences from the Puritan mainstream. Secondly, I emphasize the fact that for all but a few years of their first decade in America, they were devoid of a clergyman, meaning that the congregation was shaped and led by the lay elder William Brewster and other laymen. And finally, I advanced the argument that it was Plymouth Congregationalism, espoused by the lay deacon Samuel Fuller, that helped to determine the religious practices of the first settlements in Massachusetts, and thus of the New England Way, and the consequences of this for the English debates of the 1640s. In addition to the work on the Oxford Handbook of Puritanism, I'm currently working on an edition of the lesser-known writings of Plymouth's Governor William Bradford, and in particular his two surviving dialogues, a discussion of the Puritan tradition presented in the form of a conference between the young men of the colony and the ancients. While those two projects take up most of my time, I'm also in the process of looking more closely into what we can find out about the role of women in Puritan congregations. And this is sort of the last thing that I want to talk some about at this point. The seeds of this inquiry were planted when I was working on my biography of John Davenport, and fed by what I found in studying the role of the laity in general in Puritan congregations. In particular, I was intrigued by something I found while looking at the English Puritan congregation in the Netherlands. John Davenport, spent some time in Rotterdam, where he followed Hugh Peter in the ministry of the English congregation there. Looking at how that church had been reformed by Peter, I came across what I still consider one of the most fascinating accounts of early Puritanism. Having covenanted together to reform their church, the congregants called upon John Forbes, representing the classis of English churches in the region, to preside over the election of officers. The event was described by Stephen Goff, who was a hostile critic. According to Goff's account, Forbes called upon the congregation members to approve of Peter as their pastor. After hands were raised, Forbes said, quoting Goff, "I see the men choose him, but what do the women do?" Hereupon, Goff continues, the women lift up their hands too. It's clear evidence that in this congregation, at least, women participated in the election of the ministers. How common was this? Our general sense that women played a subordinate role in public matters has led us to assume that they did not vote at all in matters of church government. But is that true? And how true is it? Well, I'm going to be working on this for quite some time, but I want to share a number of facts and events that I've come across that suggest the role of women might have been greater than we acknowledge. Going back to the roots of lay empowerment, the 16th century English reformer William Tyndale, who set out to translate the Bible into English, stated as his goal that he wished to enable the boy who drove the plow to know more of the scriptures than many clergymen, arguing that there are many found among the laymen which are as wise as their officers. Tyndale opposed the monopoly or authority claimed by ordained clergy, and once went so far as to argue that women could preach and administer the sacraments if necessity required. In Puritanism, women were expected to read the scriptures and generally expected to lead family prayers when the head of the household was absent. But some were also allowed to do so in cases where the female was considered more knowledgeable or pious. Various women of different social status, including Margaret Hobby, Jane Radcliffe, Anne Fenwick, Mary Simpson, were recorded as having led discussions of religious groups. Bridget Cook of Kersey, England, led a group of believers in exploring their faith. Anne Hutchinson shared her views with a group of believers in Alford, Lincolnshire, before she came to New England, and then, of course, did the same thing in Boston, Massachusetts. Every one of the collections of shared lay professions of faith I mentioned earlier includes contributions by women. Women speaking of their spiritual experience to enlighten an audience that did include men. John Bunyan recalled that it was while listening to a group of women sitting in a doorway talking about a new birth, the work of God in their hearts, and also how they were convinced of their miserable state by nature, that led to Bunyan's own conversion. As for participating in church gatherings, women likely had a larger role in the Leiden church than in most Puritan congregations. John Robinson believed that women may make a profession of faith or confession of sin, say amen to the church prayers, sing psalms vocally, accuse a brother of sin, witness an accusation, or defend themselves if they were accused. He went further, writing that one faithful man, yea, or woman either, may as truly and effectually loose and bind both in heaven and earth as all the ministers in the world. And on another occasion, Robinson stated that in a case extraordinary, namely when no man will, I see not, but a woman may reprove the church rather than suffer it to go on in apparent wickedness. Most congregational churches allowed for lay prophesying. where members could ask questions about sermons and offer their own insights into scripture. The majority of clergy who wrote on the subject rejected the idea that women be allowed to prophesy, citing St. Paul's injunction to the Corinthians that women be silent in church, and Timothy's instruction to not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. John Robinson, however, denied that Paul was urging a universal and absolute position, restraint of women prophesying, arguing that the apostle was rejecting this as an ordinary practice, but implicitly allowing women who were immediately and extraordinarily and miraculously inspired to speak without restraining. And to support this, Robinson cited the fact that Philip the Evangelist had 4 daughters which did prophesy, and that in the presence of the apostle. It should be noted that in the Scrooby, Leiden, Plymouth congregation and other churches following congregational practices, women took a leading role in the organization of the churches. Furthermore, they were admitted on the basis of their own qualifications, regardless of the position or faith of their fathers or husbands. 8 of the 12 founding pillars of the church at Bedford in England in the 1640s were women. In the 1630s, a group of members of the English Reformed Church in Amsterdam, who had been thwarted in their efforts to elect first Thomas Hooker and then John Davenport to be ministers in that church, petitioned their pastor, John Paget, to make changes in the governance of that congregation. Women signed that petition, and among the points debated in the church consistory was allowing women a role in ministerial elections. 1 or 2 more things. In 1623, Plymouth's Governor William Bradford wrote to the colony's backers in England, responding to complaints that had been registered against the colony. And he wrote that touching our government, you are mistaken if you think we admit women and children to have to do in the same governing, for they are excluded, as both reason and nature teach us they should be. The question is, where did this charge come from that Plymouth allowed women to participate in the civil government? A possible answer is that women were allowed to participate to some degree in church matters, which made some critics conclude they also had a vote in civil matters. I find it suggestive that once some of the institutional structures on behavior were removed following the outbreak of the Puritan Revolution, many women in England emerged as preachers. Elizabeth Poole spoke before the Council of Officers of the Army. There were numerous female street preachers in London. Sarah Dudley Kane, the daughter of sometime Massachusetts Governor Thomas Dudley, the sister of the poet Anne Bradstreet, and the daughter-in-law of Boston's merchant Robert Kane, followed her husband from Boston to London, where, according to a fellow New Englander, she has grown a great preacher. Margaret Fell came from a Puritan background to become a leading Quaker and author of Women Speaking Justified, asserting female rights to preach. And in New England, many of the supporters of Anne Hutchinson, most notably Mary Dyer, became Quakers. This last point raises a whole different issue, the relationship of Quakerism to Puritanism, and it's another point that I've been reconsidering. Early in my career, I was dubious about arguments by the American historian James Fulton McQueer and the English scholar Geoffrey Nuttall that saw the Quakers as part of the broad Puritan movement. However, the more that I've come to see lay religious inspiration as central to the meaning of Puritanism, I become more open to the argument that Quakerism was an outgrowth of Puritanism, as if it wasn't difficult enough to define Puritanism. Anyway, okay. This talk has not honestly been intended as a sales pitch for my books, though I'm always happy to welcome new readers. Rather, what I've tried to convey by telling my story is the necessity for all of us interested in history to be open to further light, to question accepted views, to re-examine the meaning of familiar sources. And as long as we do this, our understanding of the past and of Puritanism in particular is going to continue to be enriched. And that's all I have to say specifically, and I'm going to be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. Thanks a lot. I mean, that was, I think, very helpful for the candidates to the Agrégation. Thank you for giving the timeline at the beginning, which was very, very clear and very helpful as well, and for showing us the importance of the transatlantic perspective when we study Puritanism. Although for the candidates here, North America is not part of the subject per se, but still, I mean, it's very important, and that's why also we wanted to hear you on your own research. And thank you also for this development on women. I mean, that was very interesting, especially as I mean, there have been a number of studies on women and Puritanism, but they're never completely I mean, there's no clear conclusion on the specificity of the relation between women and Puritanism. So maybe you can develop on this later on. I just wanted, before we can, we can take questions from the audience. Since we insist on the fact that historiography is very important for the candidates to the Agrégation. How do you define your own approach? Is there a particular historical school to which you would say you belong, or how do you? I mean, you've given a lot of elements here, but
I really don't identify myself with any particular area. I was. Let me put it this way, at a couple of points, and I'll try to I'll try and bear in mind what our audience is interested in. I find that the study of Puritanism in England is much more vibrant and has been for a number of decades than the study of Puritanism in America. And I think one of the reasons for that is that in America, in recent decades, and more so even more recently, the political situation has led to a de-emphasis on religion per se. In the academy, in universities, there's a tendency to confuse faith with fanaticism, to link Puritans with modern, very conservative politically evangelicals, and to dismiss anything that might come from Puritanism. A leading American commentator a number of years ago published an op-ed in the New York Times in which he basically said that America began in 1776. And there's a tendency to say everything before that, before the Enlightenment and Jefferson and everything else, is worthless. And this has had an impact. When we did the Encyclopedia of Puritanism, if you were actually to do a study of all the contributors, most of the people who were writing on American Puritanism were older scholars, older than I was at the time. Most of the people who made contributions on English Puritanism were much younger. people like Tom Webster and his generation. And I think part of this is that it has become possible to dismiss the importance of Puritanism in America. You can't do that in England because you're talking about, for one thing, the controversies about the origins of what is still a national church, even if not paid attention to by a lot of people. But you also are looking at what you can still call the Puritan Revolution or England's wars of religions. Puritanism was central in a way that cannot be denied. And so in the universities, it's still important to study this, and it's recognized as such. So it's a different situation than America. And we find the same thing with the handbook on Puritanism. It's a fair amount of vitality on literary approaches to Puritanism in America, but it's as far as academics, less attention to Puritanism in America, and very little to religion. I mean, Mike Winship, who teaches University of Georgia, is very seriously involved with religion, but Mike's a contemporary of mine, and there aren't a whole lot. There are some, but not a whole lot of younger scholars. A long way of coming to say, perhaps, that one of the things that probably defines me in terms of how I approach the subject is that I do take the faith of these people seriously. This is not to say that I am a Puritan in my personal beliefs and such, but I recognize that there is a level of reality in what these people describe and what the faith meant to them. And I think it's important to appreciate where they're coming from. And in that regard, there are a lot of, I think, contemporary historians that are dealing with English or British Puritanism that would fit in the same category. I think Patrick Collinson was very important in moving things in this direction, and many of his students, including John Coffey and there were people like Crawford Gribben, John Morrow for the mid 17th century. So, it's to be perfectly honest, when I try and track English historiography and say who's a revisionist and who's a post-revisionist, and I really can't figure that out myself. So I have sympathy for any students who are trying to figure that out. But that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are actually many questions in the chat. So what I'm trying to do as you speak is try to group them into similar themes. So I try to go through them all, and I hope I won't forget any, and I hope that we'll have time to answer them all, even briefly. But perhaps let me start by a question about how would you say the English Puritans differed from the New England ones? I mean, can you sort of talk us through some of the main differences between, I suppose, English Puritanism and New England Puritanism, which is a question that would require possibly a couple of hours to start answering, yeah. But if you could.
I think probably the one thing that's the most significant is the issue of toleration. And clearly in England, during the 1640s and then continuing into the 1650s, there was no government that was any longer capable of defining and enforcing a particular orthodoxy. And in New England, you did have more of an attempt to keep an orthodoxy. One of the things that I've talked about in some of my works is New England has tried to build a perimeter fence within which you have legitimate discourse, and they do disagree on something, but they try to define what is not going to be tolerable. And of course, for a long time, Baptists are not tolerable. Quakers are certainly not tolerable. Now, this doesn't alienate. New Englanders have an understanding of why this should be so. There's a wonderful letter that Thomas Shepard, clergyman of Cambridge, writes to friends in England. And basically he says, you know, we all came here for a certain reason, and it's easier for us to to get broad agreement on things, to have unity, if not uniformity. In England, you can't banish people who disagree, because these are people who grew up there with these various beliefs and so forth. And so the circumstances in England, you know, you can't do what Boston does with Anne Hutchinson or Roger Williams and kick them out. I mean, because these are Englishmen. And so New Englanders have some understanding of why toleration is more likely to be necessary in England, until the truth will win everyone over and eventually everyone will believe the right thing. But I think that's the critical issue is going to be on toleration. And circumstances force English Puritans to move towards creating toleration within the broader Puritan community.
Thank you. Right, let me move on to a question about Puritanism in Quakers, or Quakerism. And one of the candidates wanted to you to say a little bit more about that, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, as I indicated, it's something I'm changing my mind on a little bit. The problem with Puritanism, to start with that, is that as opposed to even Quakers, but say the Lutherans or other religious bodies, there is no single, what you could call Puritan church. There is no one statement of position. And so how do we define Puritanism? And some people talk about it as a temperament. They're the more godly, people that believe similar to other people, but they take it further. My own work has been pushing more towards, and this probably goes back to my trying to understand their religion, that the central theme for them, or the central thing that's important, is the inspiration of the Spirit. And to the degree that the individual can be inspired by the Spirit, you can see how one can make the jump to the Quaker belief in the inner light. So I think, and it's not a coincidence that many people who end up Quakers start out as Puritans in some way, shape, or form. Now, where I would draw a distinction is that Puritans take the position that anyone reading the scripture can achieve a true understanding by the inspiration of the Spirit, which directs them to the meaning of the scripture. Quakers don't require the scripture. The inner light can speak to you directly without the scripture. And I think that is a major jump. And I would see that as the key element that distinguishes Quaker spiritualism, if you wish, from the Quaker belief in the inner light.
Thank you. Let's stay away from England for a little while. And there's a question about how Puritanism developed in the West Indies. And also, if you could say a little bit more about the Puritans and the settlers' attitudes towards Native Americans.
Okay. Let me start with a general observation that applies both to slaves, which I'll address in the West Indies, and also Native Americans. Puritans did not believe that grace was restricted to people of any one color. And so in New England, for instance, you will have a number of instances of Black slaves who are admitted into full church membership. Particularly, there's one example in Dorchester, Massachusetts, where a Black female slave is admitted into full church membership on the assumption that she is one of the elect, even though her master is not yet a member of the church. So, and Cotton Mather writes a number of things on slaves, and he creates a society of Negroes in which Black slaves in the Boston area in the early 18th century will come together and share their faith. The same with Native Americans. There are thousands of Native Americans who are converted, and many of whom come to live in what were called praying towns. John Eliot, the Puritan clergyman, translated the Bible with the help of native interpreters who were Christianized into the Algonquin language. So again, there was no problem with seeing natives as fellow saints. That did not mean that there was a whole lot of difference in terms of social structure. Puritans accepted slavery, and this brings us to the West Indies. Providence Island, which was established as a Puritan colony, had the practice of slavery. Puritanism could affect how you treat your slaves, generally better. They believed that, Puritans believed, and this is explicit in Massachusetts laws, that someone captured in war, and the assumption was that any African who ended up the American had been captured and sold to slavery, could be enslaved. It did not necessarily affect your offspring. So in Massachusetts, you might be a slave, but your children were not slaves automatically. Slaves had to be taught to read in Massachusetts. But yes, there's no question that in areas where slavery was economically desirable as terms of labor force, the Puritans did allow slaves. In a collection of biographical essays I did, First Founders, I tell what I find is a fascinating story of one of John Winthrop's sons, Samuel Winthrop, who ends up settling in Antigua, owns slaves, has a large sugar plantation, and eventually becomes a Quaker. So this unites a couple of the questions that we've had. But he's a slave owner, and there's no question of that. So Puritanism in the West Indies can exist in accompaniment with slavery, which was a social institution. But again, as opposed to in some areas where there's a refusal to Christianize slaves because of the idea that that would make them free, or you would have to free them. Puritans don't hold to that. You can be a Christian and also a slave.
Thank you. Let's move on to a slightly different topics. There are a few questions about Puritan practices in the private sphere, and in particular, the role of women or mothers or wives in the private sphere. Thank you.
Okay. First thing to say is that you really have to be very careful about generalizing on this, and we have some letters and so forth. At the most fundamental level, Puritans believed that everything created, including every impulse that we have, comes from God. And so there's a question of whether you use what God has given us or whether you abuse it. one of the big stereotypes, particularly in our country, is that Puritans were against sex. No, they're not against sex at all. In fact, when they want to describe the immense joy that comes from a union with Christ, they often use the analogy of marital sex. Sex was given to express love within a marital relationship. Now, that means everything else is an abuse of God's order. And so, yes, they're going to be very opposed to Hester Prynne and make her wear scarlet letter. They're going to cast out other people for things. But basically, you have that. It's the same in the private sphere if you talk about drinking. Puritans are not against drinking. It was one of, almost everything they drank was alcoholic. They were against drunkenness. So it's a question of use, abuse. As far as women within the household, women frequently have a large role to play. They are surrogate husbands when the husband is away. When John Winthrop was a boy, his father was frequently away on legal and college business. His mother ran the household, oversaw the servants, led the family in prayers, and so forth. So, I mean, I don't know how much of within the private sphere one would want, but I would say that you have to be very careful about generalizing, because I talked about sex. You can find some people who are very hung up on sex among the Puritans, but you have some writing that says this, a diary that says that. You have to be careful about generalizing from any of them.
Thank you. Let me move on to a couple of questions about Calvinism and predestination. And of course, one of the questions that we always ask is, how do people manage to know whether they were elect or reprobates? Which links it to, I think, another question that's been asked about practical divinity, and whether you know where we could find the same type of survey you started with for Puritanism, but for practical divinity and the practical theologians.
Okay. Well, let me address the Calvinism thing. Yeah, I mean, for anyone, I guess, who is of a religious inclination since from the beginning of Christianity, probably to the present, the key question is, how do I know if I've been saved? And of course, the real answer that even many Puritans would give is that you don't know until you see who greets you on the other side of life, whether it's God or the devil. Calvinists, and the Puritans were Calvinists on this, obviously believed that those who were elect were chosen by God with no consideration of who they were or how they led their lives. I mean, predestination is in essence arbitrary. The question was, how might you, as you pose it, how might you know if you're one of the elect? The assumption was that your natural condition was sinful, that people were born with original sin and they were inclined to sin. God's grace could transform the soul, the heart, so that you could better perceive what was godly, and you would have more motivation to move in that direction. So, in essence, if you were saved that would be reflected in your behavior. And so you could take hope from the fact that you seem to be behaving in a godly fashion. But this is all still very, very tentative. And one of the reasons why, you know, I came increasingly to distrust Morgan's view that these are conversion narratives is that conversion is never over, in a sense. No one ever, well, I already said to be careful about generalizing. With that caveat, we don't find people who say, I'm one of the elect and I don't have to worry about it anymore. You always have doubts. I mean, John Winthrop has doubts till, you know, his last years. Have I misinterpreted things? Am I relying too much on what I'm doing? So there is. Now, obviously, you're setting up a situation where you could argue that not that Calvin designed it this way deliberately, but that Calvinism sets up a system in which you actually subconsciously are driven to do good things, because then when you reflect on the good things you've done, you think you're more likely to have been saved, and so you feel better. So you're not really feeling better because you've done something good, but because of what that signifies. So, I mean, there is attention to there's attention to behavior for what it might signify, but then there's always the danger that people might believe that by doing these things, they will earn salvation, because that you can't do. Stephen Lobb, who's a late 17th century English Puritan, at one point talks about the difficulty of steering a course between the two extremes of antinomianism, which totally disassociate behavior from anything. It not only can it save you, but it can't even be an indication of salvation. And Arminianism on the other extreme, saying, well, you know, there are some ways in which behavior can be understood within the complex of predestination. And, you know, most Puritans, a lot of them fall between and waffle. You know, they'll move towards an Arminian position and then sort of react and go to the other. But it's in many ways a very unstable belief system in terms of you know, knowing that you were saved or not. The other side, which I certainly think most of us would find totally I'm not even sure how to put it, but maybe I'm willing to consider, is that what Puritans will tell you is that even if you are damned, God still expects you to behave this way, because that's God's will. And so you should follow God's will, even if it's not going to do you a darn bit of good and you're going to end up spending eternity in hell. That's pretty grim.
Thank you. I think there's still a few questions, but I don't think we should go much beyond 6:30, partly because I'm afraid we're going to be cut off by the system, but I think we've got another few minutes. Could you, there's a very specific question that perhaps you can answer about, if you had to give just a few sources such as diaries or letters, so not coming from members of the clergy, but a few ego documents, for instance, who could characterize for us better the everyday life of English Puritans, what would they be? What would you recommend them to read?
There are diaries, the diaries, and there's an edited collection, abridgment of the diaries of Nehemiah Wallingford, who's a London, Ralph Jocelyn, who's a clergyman. Those I think would be good examples. There is John Winthrop's sort of spiritual diary, which is accessible, and his correspondence would be useful. But and I don't know how much it would shed on this, but there is I'm told, and I believe, brilliant new edition of the writings of Oliver Cromwell that John Morrow has just brought out in the last month, which unfortunately I can't afford, but which, if your library gets it, I think that's probably, because I think Cromwell is an interesting person. I think that would be useful. The Diary of Samuel Sewall in New England talks a lot about everyday life and experiences, how he understands, there's thunder at night. How does he interpret this? Is this a sign from God? Whatnot. So I think things of that sort.
Thank you. And could we go back for a few seconds, and then I'll ask you one final question, but could we go back for a few seconds, perhaps some questions of definitions, and especially on the questions of Puritans, of Puritanism, and do you have something to say about, again, a very large topic, but how do you think today we should start defining a Puritan or Puritanism?
I think the idea that it's a movement of people who are trying to reform the church that they are part of, and trying to bring the message of the gospel into their lives. And I mean, this could be a definition that applies to a lot of people in a lot of different groups, but within the context of English and American 17th century religion, I mean, I think that basically gets it. Can I make a point that quickly, and then I know you have one last question, and hopefully you don't get it. One of the things I would like to address to anyone in the audience who's thinking about history and so forth. One of the problems we have in our country, at least at this time, is an oversimplification of the lives of people and so forth. And I've given a lot of talks recently in which I start by citing Oliver Cromwell's instructions to Peter Lagus, who was going to paint his portrait, and that he paint the portrait warts and all. We as historians need to look at the Puritans warts and all. And all too often, there are studies that try to glorify them and ignore their failings, but there are also studies that only look at the warts. They want to say, oh, these were horrible people. How could anyone have liked them? How could anyone? And we need a balance. We need a balance. We need warts and all.
We need sympathetic Puritans, to paraphrase the title of the book. And just very last question, and perhaps to tie it up to present time, some of the candidates wonder about what your view would be about the way Puritanism has influenced contemporary American society and still continues, perhaps in some ways, to influence American society.
I've ended up writing I ended up moving in and writing my own essay for the Handbook of Puritanism. Something on how Puritanism has been perceived from its original time down to the present in England and America. And it's very different. And I would say in England, there's been a tendency to look more at what Puritanism meant in terms of church structure, but also in terms of politics, whether it be the levelers or the strong influence of Puritanism on Labour Party politicians going back into the late 19th century and into Foote and other people in recent time. In America, it's almost always a moralistic approach. And you know, Maureen Dowd had an editorial a few months back in the New York Times in which she referred to the Dodd decision of the Supreme Court eliminating Roe v. Wade as the latest Puritan triumph and the greatest one since Roger Williams was exiled from Massachusetts. There are people on the left and on the right who use Puritanism based on misapprehensions. My own feeling is one of the neglected areas, and Abram Van Engen in his book on City on a Hill and others have pointed to it, others that I've tried to as well. One of the critical things of Puritanism for me is the ideas expressed in John Winthrop's City on a Hill, not that they should be a model, but that we have to be together in this work as one man. We have to share, we have to labor together, mourn together, suffer together, etc. There's a very strong communitarian message that comes from the Puritans about how we need to come together and work together. Now, did John Winthrop bring everyone into Massachusetts? No, he had his blind spots. But just as we take Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence and reinterpret them to expand who all men are, so I think Winthrop's idea of community can be a model into which we bring all people and learn to appreciate them and work together with them. Because this is a communitarian society in many ways in 17th century New England. But that's my little sermon for the moment.
Thank you, and I think you've done, quite enough for tonight. Thank you so much for your generosity. And back to Sandrine, perhaps for some conclusion words.
Well, I don't know, just thank you so much. I think that was very helpful. Unfortunately, there are probably questions that we couldn't, answer.
You can find my email address easily enough, and anyone who has questions that you want answered, email me and I'll do my best to get responses back to you.
Wow, thanks so much. But you can see that there are 240 people connected now. So I hope,
I'm retired.
Okay, good. Thank you. So anyway, I think we'll be ready.
Sorry, we've lost you, Sandrine.
Oh, sorry. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's better. That's better.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So you said, Frank, that you would talk to us again in February.
Sure.
About yes. So, well, that's another time when you can also answer questions that maybe were not answered today. So well, thank you very much. I mean, that's
and that was great, and thank you to all the participants. And unfortunately, we can't see you, but and so sorry for the glitches at the beginning. But it was the very first time we had been using that particular system, which looks like Zoom, but is in fact not entirely like a Zoom meeting. And just to remind you that we've got another one with John Coffey and Paul Lim coming up next December around a Cambridge Companion to Puritanism. And then in February, Frank again with Anne Hughes and Greg Salazar for the forthcoming handbook, which we do hope will be published before the end of our 2 years, but we're not quite sure. But where you can tell us more about the forthcoming volume and how you plan it over the years. So thank you very much again, and thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight.
Bye.